Welcome to the School Leaders Podcast. My name is Dr. Gastred Harrigan, the podcast for current and emerging school leaders, those who support and supervise them. You will hear from passionate educational leaders who are transforming their schools, communities, and creating positive outcomes for students. I will also share my personal reflections and tips from over 15 years as a school leader. Together, we will talk about how to level up our schools and leadership practices. Hello and welcome to the School Leaders Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Gastred Harrigan. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to encourage all of our listeners to join the School Leaders Podcast community on Facebook. There we continue and extend our conversation from the episode. Today, I have a special guest, Dr. Karen. She is a licensed speech and language pathologist. She is also the founder and CEO of Karen LLC. It's a company that focuses on empowering educators to support them around language, literacy, executive functioning, and cognitive wellness. She also provides training, PDs, and services to pediatric therapists to better support their caseload, gain control of their time, and create freedom to provide services that really, truly makes an impact to students. Join me in welcoming Dr. Karen to the School Leaders Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am honored that you are here on the School Leaders Podcast. Before we, before we jump right in, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
All right. So I will start at the beginning. I started practicing as an SLP back in 2004. I spent 14 years in the school systems as a school speech pathologist. And at the same time that I was doing that, I was working on my doctorate in special ed. And while I was in that program, I originally thought that I wanted to go into higher ed. I always knew I really liked research. And as I was doing that, a lot of the courses in the special ed program were overlapping with the director of special education credential. And I really liked those classes on leadership. And so I decided to get my director of special education credential at the same time. And so while I was doing that program, I was, working in the schools and kind of trying to figure out, what I wanted to do next. I originally thought that I wanted to be some kind of a special ed administrator or work in higher ed. And once I finished my doctoral program and started kind of exploring my, the next career options, I was doing a number of different things. I was looking into, director of special ed positions. I was looking into higher ed. And then I was also kind of dabbling in some self-employment options like private practice and doing online courses for therapists because I always really enjoyed teaching. I always felt like I had a lot of information that I could share. And there were always a lot of things that I felt as a therapist where I was like, I wish someone would come up with some kind of a process or a system so that it would make my life easier. And so that's really what I did during my doctoral work. So during that whole career exploration phase, I was kind of throwing a lot of different things at the wall. And the thing that stuck was the online professional development. And so I just, went that route, started building up the business while I was working in the schools, and then eventually left the school systems in 2018 to really focus on the online professional development and the business. And so the specific, really the first direction I went with that was supporting speech and language pathologists in providing intervention for kids who needed assistance in the area of language and literacy. But as I started doing that, I realized that, those therapists specifically, when you're thinking about supporting language, when you're thinking about just supporting independent functioning, it's really a team effort. And so I was helping the therapists figure out, what do I do when I have a student in front of me? And for a lot of them, once they get their feet under them, they realize, wow, I've got to get the whole team on board if I really want to support my students across the board. It's really got to be a team effort. And so that's why, the last couple of years, I've been really focusing on how I can support not just the speech pathologist, but the whole IEP team. So I'm really kind of bringing in my special ed leadership background to figure out how can I support, like the psychologist, the social worker, the special ed teacher. What information do the administrators need so that they can make sure that they're providing good opportunities for their staff, and just how can I help the whole IEP team work together? So really that's the direction that I'm going currently with the business and with the work that I'm doing.
That is so awesome, and I'm glad you shared the various things and how it got you to where you are today with some of the work. And we're gonna jump into all of my listeners. We are gonna jump into some of the work that she's doing right now and how Dr. Karen can support your team and your leadership. But before we jump in, if you could reflect a little bit, on some of the lessons you learned, and really from the lens of those lessons that you learned as a speech and language pathologist that can inform the work that principals and school leaders do.
So let's see, there's a lot of different directions that I could go with this, but I think one of the biggest challenges that some of the therapists have is that they are in a lot of their pre-service training trained in more of the medical model. And so when they come into a school setting, a lot of times having to layer that onto the way things are in the schools and the education model, it really can get a little bit confusing as far as what our role is and what we're supposed to be doing. Our scope is really broad. So, a speech pathologist can, they can treat things like, they're could be working with adults who have had brain injuries or strokes. They can be working with people who have vocal nodules and need to do, voice therapy. And then in the schools, when they, come into the school setting, a lot of times they're getting all kinds of referrals for, there might be kids who stutter. The biggest portion of their caseload is going to be kids who aren't pronouncing sounds the right way. So that would be, considered in the area of speech sound disorders. That's the thing that I think a lot of people is a little bit more apparent to other people who aren't familiar with the field. And then one of the biggest things that was a challenge for me was the language and the literacy, because if you're a speech pathologist or really anybody on that IEP team in the school, one of the biggest areas that you're going to be thinking about giving support for kids is in the area of literacy. And this is an area that is so broad. It's not an area where there is kind of a standard protocol. Some of the other things like, again, stuttering, vocal function exercises for people who have nodules, even some of the other things like, swallowing disorders is another thing that we work with. And so some of those things have more of a, here are some protocols, but for language and literacy, it just is so broad. And then there's these other team members who are also working on those areas. So that is where I think it was the biggest challenge for me specifically, and where I felt like, this is an area where I need to keep developing myself and then figure out how, you can't really just think about what's my job. You have to think about, zoom out from a bird's eye view and what's everybody doing, because that's what's going to tell you what you should be doing. Because, you have to consider your area of expertise, but you also have to consider how everybody's working together. And I think that from a principal's perspective, you are already thinking like that, but the therapists aren't. Like, their brain is sort of very much in the trenches. I like to say even sometimes in the weeds, where it's what's going on right here, right now in front of me. And it can be really hard to think specific tactical and then also zoom out and think about the whole team, which you're probably doing all the time. And I think that sometimes the people who are in the trenches need a little bit of help and modeling and guidance to figure out how to think that way, because I think it will help everybody work together. But it can be really hard because it's not how we were trained. We were trained to look at the patient, evaluate them, come up with a treatment plan. It wasn't this whole complex system of people working together, even though there are, in medical settings, multidisciplinary teams as well. So I think that's one of the areas where I'm constantly harping, to the therapist, where it's like, you got to think big picture. You have to think about where you work in this whole ecosystem of people. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that where, we could use some support and guidance, because you already think like that.
And it's interesting you just said, because oftentimes my therapists, my speech and language pathologists, my ESE folks will come, and you are correct. They are looking at their area of expertise, and oftentimes trying to get them to see the global, the bigger picture. And also, one of the things I heard you say is the medical model versus the educational model. Didn't even think about it. Not now, right? As a school leader, but by listening to you, that let me know why often my therapist will be saying, well, really we should be doing it this way, but in this
Mhm.
context, that way, trying to compare the two different aspects. And I think that's important for school leaders to understand, as experts in their field, trying to take and being trained in the medical model and trying to infuse that in the educational setting can provide some the biggest pain points and challenges. So from that perspective, um, how can school leaders support the plethora, whether it is their, I'll use the term therapist, but really it could be their speech and language pathologist, it could be their psychologist, it could be their social
Mhm.
worker, their ESC specialist, coordinator, facilitator, the family therapist. How do they really guide, in your perspective, how can they guide and support them, knowing that they may be facing some challenges, how to look at it globally to support the specific child in front of them.
So one of the biggest complaints that I get when I tell people, or I guess sort of the objection that I get when I say you need to really work at a team, the biggest issue is time to meet together. So I think figuring out ways that you can communicate efficiently and coming up with systems and processes, and just the idea of thinking about a system, or even just figuring out multiple modes of communication. So, email, do we always have to meet face to face? Is there a way that we can use, I was listening to a podcast last night where they said communicate in the cloud, where it's almost like, you might have documents where you're messaging back and forth. So any kind of way that we can figure out ways that a big team of people can communicate, whether it be, in person. Yes, you do need some FaceTime just for rapport and relationships. That's good. But also just for efficiency, and the idea that people can maybe communicate asynchronously, and figuring out ways to help people do that, or just even that's a thing you can do. That can be something that I think can be really helpful, because a lot of times they just can't work as a team. They know that they should be, they feel bad that they're not, and they also, it gets kind of lonely, and you're kind of siloed off when you can't talk to your other team members, and then, there's miscommunication because you're not talking to people, all of those things. So really just figuring out the time barrier is an issue, or just knowing that you might have to, allow for the time. So that is one of the big things with the medical versus the educational model. One of the challenges that therapists have is that sometimes, I am a school practitioner. So, and this happened a lot for me, where you might have the credentials and the background and the experience to be able to diagnose certain things or do certain assessments, but because you're working in the school system, it's not educationally relevant. So you can't provide those services. Or maybe that there's something that the child needs that needs to come from an outside medical provider, and it's really hard for you to do your job in the school setting if that's not addressed. But then it gets a little bit messy, where it's like, if you tell a parent, go get this evaluation, then it's, does the school have to, were they recommending it? Do they have to pay for it? So I think just guidance and how to word that. One of the things that has come up a lot in, for me, or just on a lot of teams, and this is not just with speech pathologists, it's with the whole team, is what if you have a student who, you think maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they have a diagnosis, and you need to have the conversation of pharmaceutical interventions or other outside therapy that might need to be done above and beyond the school setting. And it's like, again, that whole thing of, well, how do we say this in a way where we're giving the kid what they need? And there's this, we're utilizing our resources, but at the same time, we're not going to do something that's not authorized by the administrator, and then, all that kind of thing. So I think that those are, that comes up a lot. Knowing how to word that, understanding how to, like what is authorized, how you want us to handle that kind of thing. That's always good. And figuring out also how to, work with parents in a way that nudges them in the right direction when you know that it's going to be really hard to do what we need to do at school if this other stuff isn't addressed.
Yeah, and one of the things you said earlier on was working in a team setting, and oftentimes the various members of an IEP team, often because of each of their areas of expertise, often don't work, or it doesn't lend itself. And one of the things I think I want to stress to all my leaders that are listening, I know it significantly improved the culture and the support team was we have a weekly, I set up a weekly dedicated time for
Hmm.
everybody to meet, not necessarily discussing one child per se, but it's a time where to meet and discuss concerns among themselves or issues. And most of it is it's just different students that they are addressing that maybe a special ed child, or maybe just got recommended to be evaluated, or maybe we need to look at the specific kid. And that quiet time has done significant magic in building relationship, and making it easier to share and dialogue with your colleagues. And so that's very important. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I really want to
Hmm.
stress to my school leaders and principals listening, create a time for the team, everyone, to really dialogue on a regular basis. So that way they could address concerns and issues. So when they do get into that IEP meeting, certain the friction is not already high because we've been
Yeah.
in our silos all that time. Now, talking about IEP teams, and oftentimes as principal, I find myself trying to put out fire and trying to resolve conflicts and misunderstanding. What are some of the kind of issues that you have seen that happens between and among IEP teams that are in the trenches, and how do you think leaders can support those IEP team before those things escalate to where it's impacting the culture of the school?
One of the things that's come up a few times for me is where there are accommodations on the IEP and they are not necessarily being implemented in the classroom, or there's confusion about how that needs to look. So sometimes, I've seen cases where a student has an accommodation and the teacher feels like it's unfair because they're getting this extra help or something like that, and so they don't get the accommodation, and then the parents are upset because the student's not getting what they need, and then the special ed teacher's trying to figure out, how do I keep the parent happy, but then also how do I work with the teacher and figure out where they're coming from, like, is there something that I maybe need to change? Is this accommodation appropriate? Or do they need to be a little bit more flexible with how they are supporting the student in their classroom? That's something that has come up where it really would have been helpful for administrators to come in and mediate. And because it really does put the teacher, or whoever the IEP case manager is, it could be the special ed teacher, could be the therapist, there could be a special ed coordinator involved, depending on how it works in the district. So getting on the same page about accommodations and implementing them, how it looks when they're being implemented, that is something that has come up. And I think that from the teacher's perspective, I think a lot of times they feel like they don't have the support to do the accommodations because they've got this whole class that they're trying to support, and then I've got to do this other thing. So it really is a two-way street where both parties probably need to meet in the middle and compromise a little bit. So helping people navigate that can be helpful. That's a big one that's come up where it could have, and again, if it's escalated to the point where the parent's upset, then that's not good. It's always good to be able to address it before it gets to the point where the parent is upset. Or some other things that have happened is when there is a parent who gets an outside evaluation, and I share this because whenever I do have a lot of therapists that I work with, there's a mix of people who work in medical settings. There's people who work in school settings. Some people are in private practice. And so if people are in private practice or a medical setting, they don't have to go by the school eligibility guidelines. And so a lot of times they might be able to provide a service that the school's not providing, especially if it's private practice and the parents can afford to do private pay and not go through insurance. A lot of times that therapist can provide services that the school can't provide. And if the outside therapist is saying things and doesn't necessarily understand the school guidelines, then sometimes parents will, and this was frustrating for me as a school therapist, they will a lot of times believe the medical professional or the private practice person over the school person. And I think it's sort of a perception of value where I'm paying this person money. I see where my money's going. Yes, I'm paying taxes for this other thing over here, but they don't necessarily see it that way, or just the way that we view doctors in medical settings versus educational settings. A lot of times parents will think, well, this is a doctor, this came from a doctor's office or a medical setting, so they know what they're talking about more than the school professionals, where from my perspective, there were a lot of times people were recommending things for me, and I'm like, hey, I've got more knowledge and experience than this other person. And so that comes up a lot where the parents, come with this outside evaluation, and there's this laundry list of demands that this outside, report, what that they're wanting. And then that puts people on edge because the parents like, here it is, this is what I want you to do, and then once it gets to that point, then it is a little bit more adversarial. And it's unfortunate because I think that, I've had some great relationships with outside therapists because they can provide all this extra help. It's like, great, another person I can collaborate with. So I think where I've gone wrong as a therapist is not being proactive. And there's other times where I look back and think, wow, if I would have just had a couple more conversations with that parent, or maybe had a conversation with that private practice therapist to be like, hey, I appreciate what you're doing and, all this stuff, then maybe I could have been, maybe I misinterpreted or got defensive. And, when they come with the report with all this stuff on it, it can be kind of overwhelming. So I think just teaching your team how to work with the outside professionals can be really helpful as well, or just knowing that that's something that they're dealing with, and showing them how to be proactive with that to, like you said, put out the fires before it gets to the point where everybody's upset and feeling defensive. Because there were times where I felt like my team members were maybe being a little bit too defensive and not listening to the outside therapists, and vice versa. So it's kind of hard when it comes in the form of a really lengthy written report versus a conversation when you can hear somebody's tone of voice and all of those types of things.
And I think what you said many things. I think they're very important. I think it is important for school leaders principals to really encourage and support their people to have dialogue with outside agencies and outside therapists, because oftentimes they are seen as the enemy. And really, you're right. Parents pay for that service, and parents feel sometimes that they trust more that person's expertise than the collective expertise of the school staff. But like you indicated, it's also about having dialogues and having conversation. Parents bring in, and fine. Can I get also a release of to have a dialogue with that therapist and or that person, and really get a deeper understanding, how it would be like in a private practice and how does it look like school-based, and also having honest dialogue with parents and families. Okay, this is what the therapist is recommending. This is how it looks like at the school. So I'm not saying I'm not providing it, but it looks different. And sometimes, it's where I tell my therapist, okay, let me and you have a conversation with the family and bring whomever they have. It's not necessarily an IP meeting, but let's have some dialogue on how that looks like in the school setting. Often, not always, but often I find, I would say more 98% of the time, we walk away with the family because A, they understand we are taking that report seriously and we are valuing that. And B, this is how that support is going to look like within our context. And for my school leaders is really coming alongside your therapist, your special ed person, and guiding that dialogue with that advocate, with that lawyer, with that outside therapist, with that parent. And oftentimes, collectively, we can come, most of the time I found, to a something that is viable for the child. And I think that is invaluable. And I think for leaders, your therapist will appreciate the fact that you are able to take those difficult phone calls, right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes, like, I don't want to speak to that parent one more time, Dr. Harrigan. Can you just take this call? Not a problem. I'll speak to them and see what's going on. And I think making them feel they're supported and you are there to have those difficult, challenging dialogue is very invaluable and it's critical. I also want to go back to what you said earlier because while you were saying it, I was smiling because almost a year doesn't go by where I have to intervene because a teacher feels this accommodations is not needed for this child and they don't want to provide it. And it's unfair, especially when you talk about the kid have time and a half or double time. And,
Hmm.
and, and it's almost every year, almost every year, I have to not only do we do the training in our school, but I always have to have those individual conversations. But for the therapist, it's always or for the special ed person, it's always a stress point because they're like, oh my God, I have so much to do and now I have to get to convince this teacher to do X, Y, Z.
Hmm.
And for school leaders, giving that therapist a listening a listening ear, like you just said, understanding their frustration and really leading that dialogue and coaching them in that process too of how to address that. And often I have to say, teachers, listen, if it's in their IP, they get it. If you give an hour to, if everybody get an hour, they get double. That's what the IP call for. But I think it's not just the end result; it's the process of walking through the challenge with your therapist, with your person. And I think that's how you could make them feel supported. Especially, I don't know, in your work, in my district, we were short, talking about teacher shortages, we were short for, before the pandemic around for our therapists. It has gotten worse. And I think it's important for all my leaders that are listening that you really make your therapist, whether it is contract or in-house, feel supported, right? Because again, that will reduce them having to go to another school or having to go somewhere else because they feel they are in a supported environment. And oftentimes I tell people, um, people don't leave schools; they leave principals. And I don't know what your experience, in terms of the stress level after the pandemic that therapists have to have, just the students they're working with. How do how do they really deal with that additional load, and how does leaders really deal with extra shortage now that exists among therapists?
That's really something that everybody has been complaining about, honestly, or, just struggling with. The principals are saying, well, I don't have enough therapists to deal with, all these mental health needs. My students have all this anxiety and the work is so much more overwhelming because they missed all of this time to actually be in school there. So there's that. I would say that that's something that everybody is struggling with. I think the other thing that really does come up with the therapist is that when you have a shortage like that, then they get spread even more thin, or they get spread thinner, and then they do have to go between buildings, and so you'll have this counselor who's here once a day, or not once a day, like once a week. The speech pathologist who has to go to the high school and to the middle school, and that happens really with all of those related service providers: social work, psychology, speech pathology. OT was another one where they are all over the place. PT, all of those therapists, and it just, again, it gets kind of lonely, and sometimes people you feel like you're not really a part of a team anywhere because you're jumping around so much. And then you have to, on top of that, figure out the culture of the building. And so there's that added layer of I've got to figure out how things work here. And a lot of times, like I remember when I started, I was covering the elementary building, and then I was covering the high school building as well. And I'm used to how the elementary teachers schedule things. And then I'm covering the high school building. And the way that people are responding to me is just so different because they don't understand. I have 2 hours to get all these students in. I'm like, can you please help me out here with the scheduling? Because they're like, they don't get it. I remember one teacher was like, I was like, oh, do you want me to call down to your room to have you send him down, or do like, because like I needed to meet with the student, and the student didn't know I wasn't going to have time to meet with them, and the teacher, I was like, do you want to send him down? Like, how do you want to do this? And he got, I don't know, a little bit snippy with me and was like, you can tell him. And I'm like, I'm here for an hour, and he just didn't know. And how would he have known? He didn't know who I was. And so I think that sometimes that can come up a lot, because you sort of get thrown in, and you don't know all these teachers, and you don't know how people do things in the building, and you don't know how you're coming across, and then you're trying to do it through email and all this stuff. And so that was a thing before the pandemic, and it's just gotten worse because now we're asking people to like do all these other things. It's one of those things where you don't realize that this trickle down of what actually happens in the trenches when you have a shortage and people are spread really thin. And then the other thing is that with the time, people feel like they're just sort of like they're doing their session with a student, and a lot of the things that a therapist is working on with kids, you can do some of the work in a session that is a pull-out situation. But one of the things that I do a lot with is with executive functioning. That is really something that needs to be embedded across the entire day. And so that's one of those things where, yes, I can do some things with my student in the session, but if I literally am just there for an hour and I never talk to anybody else in that building, I don't have any other interactions with the team members, there's no way that that student's going to get the support that they need in that area. So the whole idea of just getting the team to work together and providing the supports that the services that kids needed before, it just kind of amplified. So really anything that I've mentioned in this entire conversation, it's just like multiply that by 10. So yeah, there's a lot of those things there where I think from a service delivery and a systemic, like how things are arranged as far as just how services are structured, that can be hard as well as a therapist, because you feel like you're crammed into this model of, I've got to just pull kids out, where that might not be what needs to actually happen for students to get support, and you just don't know what to do to make the other stuff happen.
You know, wow, you just said a lot, and to all my leaders that are listening, I would rewind that portion and really listen to it again, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about my speech and language therapist, which comes once a week. Um, um, that she's between two or three different schools, running. We had to move meetings to accommodate, and sometimes as school leaders and as other IEP team, we only see our role and don't understand the support that these various related professionals have to provide. I mean, each school setting is a little bit different, but the key thing is providing that support, creating creating an environment where giving them a space, right? I oftentimes I say, we have an office for you. Oh, thank you so much. You already have an office with phone. I'm like, yes. Do you need anything else? And I think it's everything you just said. They're running from buildings to buildings, and they're trying to, within a small 2-3 hours, meet all these kids, and how do we make them feel supported? And I think for all my leaders that are listening, it's important that we take the time to make them feel valued, appreciated, and the little things matter. Making sure that there's a space for them, making sure they are supported when they come in, making sure that you streamline. Are they picking up? Are they the kids coming to them? Whatever that support look like is very important. Especially we also, on top of the fact that we have shortages across the board, and I do believe as a school leader, it is all of our jobs, right? While they may report to somebody else, it is my job to create the best environment. Because again, if they come in, they're happy to work in my building, then they naturally will provide a better service to my kids. They naturally will support my parents much better. Because again, if I'm happy, if I'm feel appreciated, then the quality of service will naturally goes up. Um, as we wrap up the interview, I know that you are the owner and operator of an educational company, Dr. Karen LLC, and your company, for everyone listening, really focuses and empower educators around, to provide support around language literacy, executive functioning, cognitive awareness. So share with us some of the training, some of the PD, some of the resources you provide that could help therapists, the IEP team, even school administrators, right? They could scale up their skills and knowledge to better provide services and support. So share with us some of the things you provide.
So the things that I have right now that are built out currently, so I do have people approach me to speak to their districts. So I'm always happy to kind of come up with a customized option if people want me to come and talk to their, team of therapists or even the administrators. The programs that I have currently right now, I do have a program for speech pathologists that teaches them a system for handling their language therapy that teaches kids the language skills that they need to support reading and writing. So that one is, again, originally was designed for speech and language pathologists, but other people who have an expertise in language and literacy, like a reading specialist or a special ed teacher, I are welcome to sign up for that course. So I also am working on another program called hold on, let me back up. That program is called Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. The other program that I'm working on is called the School of Clinical Leadership, and that program is the main person that program is for the related service providers like the speech pathologist, the social worker, the school psychologist, the counselor. So the people who are responsible for providing services. Really, it is how do I describe it? It's focused on leadership, but the specific initiative that is embedded in there is getting executive functioning support across the day in schools. And I think that if, as I tell the therapists, like, you need to be figuring out how to support your students across the day. If they started with that one area, that would really address a lot of the behavioral issues, a lot of the social skills issues, a lot of the mental health issues that we're seeing with students. And it will support language and literacy as well. So that's one area where I do teach them to, what actually needs to happen as far as interventions that they can share with the teachers, that they can be doing in their therapy sessions. And then there's also a lot of work with just the collaboration and team building as well. But I found with therapists that they kind of need their clinical area where it's, okay, what's my clinical area? And then the leadership kind of is embedded on top of that. So those are my two programs that I've got going right now. I have, again, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations and the School of Clinical Leadership. And then, like I said, I'm always welcome, or I'm always happy to do some kind of a customized PD to come and talk to districts. And then I have the De facto Leaders podcast. That is a podcast for educators and therapists of really the school age population, really K through 12. And so it's really just focused on sharing inspiring stories of people who are showing leadership in some way in a clinical role, or really anybody who's doing some kind of leadership initiative in their community. So I've got all kinds of I have guests on from all different avenues, whether it be therapists, whether it be people who've done community service, and then wanting to get more school leaders on there as well to get their perspective.
Awesome. And I encourage all the principals and school district administrators that are listening to avail and reach out to Dr. Karen. She does provide, check out her website. She has plethora of resources, PDs that your team could go through. And as she indicated, she could come in and provide PDs and customize professional development to really help scale up your IEP team or district team to provide better support and services to students. As we wrap up, Dr. Karen, share with us your favorite book or your favorite quote and why.
Oh gosh. Favorite book. I have quite a laundry list, but I would say that the book that I've been thinking about most recently is Atomic Habits. Just the idea of the small habits building up over time. I think with any kind of change, it's just so hard to, I get stuck where I feel like I'm all or nothing. I have this thing I want to do, and if I'm not going to just go all in and, do this whole complete plan, then I'm just not going to do it. Whereas I think people need to give themselves some grace with just building the habit and just showing up and doing something every day and just building the habit before you focus on what actually is going in that block of time. So that's one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Can I share one more? Am I allowed to?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we went to Europe this past summer, and I'd say my favorite. We were in London and Paris, and then of course, we did the day trip to Normandy, and so that was my favorite part. So I had to, of course, go home and watch Band of Brothers again, and got into this whole rabbit hole of listening to the podcast and reading the book. And so obviously that's an amazing, an amazing series, an amazing book. But Dick Winters has a book as well called Beyond Band of Brothers, where he shares, it kind of follows the same timeline as Band of Brothers, but he shares some additional insights. And there's just so many examples of good leadership in that story, and so many examples of de facto leadership, which is really what my brand is about, where the person who wasn't, in charge, or there's somebody who's like above the chain of command that either is, not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or maybe they just aren't aware of what's going on. And somebody had to emerge as a leader and, do the job and just, rise up the ranks, or just be a leader wherever they were. And so I just, I think that's a great example of leadership. And I really enjoyed that book. So highly recommend that. Obviously, Band of Brothers is great too. But if you liked that series, check out Dick Winters' book as well, because that was a really good one.
Thank you for sharing that. And like you, I have Atomic Habits as I think I just finished one book. I think it's the third book I'm going to pick up as soon as I finish the next book. I just finished one, I think this week. I started a second one, and Atomic Habit definitely is one that I'm going to pick. Part of it is trying to be intentional to develop those habits, because those things we do consistently does have a significant impact on the work that we do and how successful we are. Again, thank you for coming on the podcast. As we wrap up, tell everyone how they can connect with you.
So I have two different websites. The one that is focused more specifically on the language and literacy is drkarenspeech.com. And then the website that has the information about my podcast and some of my programs that are more focused on the clinical leadership and executive functioning support and just kind of supporting the whole team, that website is drkarendudek-brannan.com. And then I'm on all of the, I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well. But those are the two main areas that you'll want to connect with me.
I would also put the links to your websites on the show notes. So everybody that's listening, check out the show notes, and you will find specifically the links of how to connect with Dr. Karen. Again, Dr. Karen, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insight and expertise.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. Please consider subscribing to the podcast, leave a 5-star rating and a comment, share this episode with a friend, and on social media. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook for leadership ideas and tips. Again, thank you for joining me today. Until next time.